Well, I'd like to thank Dr. Freeman for inviting me on this panel, and I apologise for not having an Australian accent. I do try and put it on sometimes, but it didn't work out for me. So Australia, with a sense of humility, reverence, and overwhelming pride, paused to remember the Dardanelles campaign every year. This year marks 100 years since the Dardanelles campaign began, and Gallipoli became a part of Australian folklore. Many raise the question, why Gallipoli? Why did a campaign that was such a major failure, tragedy, and mistake become such a poignant symbol for Australia and Australians? On the 25th of April 1915, Australia was only 14 years, 4 months, and 24 days old, a time where Australia was still going through puberty, still learning what it meant to be an Australian, who it was as a person, what mark it wanted to make on the world it is a part of. Australia, you would think, had a long time to learn these things. Like all of us, we probably didn't know what we wanted to do in life until we at least reached in our 20s, similar to me. The young Australia learnt through tragedy what it is meant to be an Australian, who they were, and what Australia stood for. The Dardanelles, specifically Gallipoli, was a premature turning point. Britain, the doting old mother, turned to the scruffy young boy and said, "Stand up, you're a man now." Gallipoli will always be regarded as an event where Australia was forged as a nation, forged in a war which many regard as a conflict that Australia should never have been a part of, especially today. Unlike today, however, Australians didn't consider themselves Australians didn't consider themselves Australian. More so, they considered themselves British. Australians were patriotic members of the British Empire. The majority of people were either first or second generation Australian, and connections with the mother country were still strong. The servicemen who signed up to go to war weren't joining up in their droves to fight for Australia. They were there to fight for the British Empire. The enthusiastic young men and women who clambered onto the steamers heading northwards were excited. This was a trip of adventure. Many hearing the stories of Europe and of Britain through their parents and or grandparents, many believed that they wouldn't be gone too long and they would be giving Jerry a good hiding, and they would be home before Christmas. This did not occur. Australian soldiers came ashore in Egypt, where they started to train in and around Cairo. The Australian soldiers were left in limbo for quite some time. As all young people do, they grew restless and incidents followed. The British didn't know what to do with the Australian Imperial Force at that time. The battle raged on the Western Front into deadlock, and Winston Churchill, along with his political peers, were searching for ways to break that deadlock. The Dardanelles campaign was brought forward, and the naval battle began. The naval battle, along with the campaign itself, was a complete disaster. Many British and Commonwealth warships were sunk in the aftermath. However, one submarine was able to duck and weave through the Turkish defences within the passage. The submarine was Australian and called AE2. It sunk a Turkish cruiser and was able to reach the Sea of Marmora. The submarine remained in the fight for 5 more days before it took irreparable damage. The captain, Lieutenant Commander Henry Stoker, Royal Australian Navy, was forced to scuttle the boat and surrender. Another way of breaking through was needed. The command structure decided a land invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula was vital to take control of the Dardanelles. The Anzac Corps, under the command of General Birdwood, who a British officer, were to be the first on the shore. The Australians landed at a place which is now revered and known as Anzac Cove. This beach, with its razor-sharp cliff tops and jagged rocks, wasn't the area where they were meant to land. The rowing boats that the Australians were given drifted, and they found themselves in a dangerous and difficult situation. The Australians started to take casualties, and this is where the Australian story truly begins. As the boys fought tooth and nail for every inch of land on Gallipoli, life in Australia carried on relatively normal. News of what was happening with the IF was at the top of everybody's mind. The first telegrams began to come through. The list of killed in action began to get slowly larger and larger. As time went by, entire communities were destroyed. In an instant, brothers, husbands, sons, lovers, they're all gone. And they all had one thing in common, Gallipoli. The Australian soldiers began to show uniquely Australian traits at Gallipoli. The Australians have and still to this day, a certain manner of how they went about their business. The stiff upper lip of British truly wasn't there. Instead, it was larrikinism, and I quote an Australian word, which means a person who acts with apparent disregard for social or political conversation. Mateship and loyalty to their mates was something that Australians are still revered for today and is shown in their sporting prestige. All right, no one likes that one. There you go, you got it. Oh, the Springboks, good fun. On the home front, Australians were coming together in hardship too. Communities kept buggering on and created care parcels for the Anzac Corps. Letters were received from the men at Gallipoli. The most common complaint was the constant meal of dried biscuits and bully beef. As Australia was so far away, a food had to be designed that would last the journey to Gallipoli. Care package began to have special biscuits within them. They're made from rolled oats, flour, desiccated coconut, sugar, butter, golden syrup, baking soda, and boiled water. I have to admit, it's a bit better than bully beef and biscuits, isn't it? There we go. To this day, Anzac biscuits, as they are now called, are in every Australian's kitchen. As Australian as custard creams are English. It may not be savoured within a trench while Turkish bullets whirl over your head anymore, but it is an everlasting memory and uniquely Australian delicacy that was forged out of Australia's involvement in Gallipoli. The loss of life was truly incomprehensible for Australians. As many may know, 8,000 Australian soldiers lost their lives. Per capita, the Australian population in 1915 was 5 million. If we had the same population of Britain per capita, we would have lost 100,000. Bitterness and anger swept over the Australian people. The feelings towards Britain and the Empire started to dwindle somewhat at this stage, although it would take World War II to truly change the direction of Australia's influences. As the troop ships entered Fremantle Port on the West Australian coast, the true barbarity, hostility, and tragedy of World War I was seen for the first time. The young men, full of excitement, energy, and adventure, came home broken, mentally and physically. Resentment towards the war followed, and as expected, support for it started to dwindle. Australians continued to have extensive roles within World War I until the end of the war, fighting on the Western Front at Villers-Bretonneux. Is my French all right? Okay. And, lost my page now. There you go. Thought it was funny. Fighting mobile skirmishes through the desert against the Ottoman Empire. A famous charge of the Light Horse was there. And also the Royal Australian Navy continuing to patrol the oceans from the Far East to the Mediterranean in search for German adversaries. The Flying Corps also supported British war efforts from Britain on the Western Front. The men that came back from Gallipoli were truly scarred. The few who magically managed to get through the campaign unscathed would then be tested again on the Western Front, as I just said. Many would consider the lucky ones as the wounded who returned home to Australia. So let's step into the present day, 2015. As a Churchillian, I can commemorate two major anniversaries this year. As a Churchillian, I remember the 50th anniversary of Winston Churchill's death. As an Australian, I remember the 100th year anniversary of Gallipoli, which was truly spectacular. All over the country, thousands upon thousands, probably millions is probably a better estimate, came out all over the country to remember 100 years of Anzac and 100 years of Gallipoli. We sent warships up to Gallipoli for the anniversary. HMAS Anzac is actually in Portsmouth right now, visiting the Royal Navy. So Winston Churchill, for me, will always be an inspiring character. A man who defended the Western world from tyranny and all his life showed great courageousness of fight. He may not have been perfect, and he did make mistakes, but he continued to strive for what he believed in and always tried to do the right thing. In Australia, he is unfortunately blamed for many of the mistakes that happened in those dreadful months on the Gallipoli Peninsula. I do feel that it is a bit of an uninformed view, though. And the Dardanelles campaign is not entirely Winston's fault. Primarily is a point that Winston raised himself in 1917, and I quote, "A fifth of the resources, the effort, the loyalty, the resolution, the perseverance vainly employed in the Battle of the Somme to gain a few shattered villages and a few square miles of devastated ground would, in the Gallipoli Peninsula, used in time, have united the Balkans on our side, joined hands with Russia, and cut Turkey out of the war." End quote. Winston strongly disapproved of the barbarity and loss of life on the Western Front. Gallipoli was a risk that in the long term could have saved many more lives, but albeit it did not. It was a dark time in his life. When he was resigned from the position of the First Lord of the Admiralty, many consider it the end of his political career. Many Australians, I doubt, would know that Winston then gained a commission within the British Army and fought in the trenches as a lieutenant colonel commanding a battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers. And I think that's quite significant. I don't think you'd see many politicians these days failing in Iraq or Afghanistan or against ISIS and then joining the army and getting on the front lines themselves. As Australia looks back at that fateful day 100 years ago, I think it's poignant to remember how far Australia has come as a nation, the trials and tribulations it has had to overcome over a century. We can certainly state that today Australia is a nation that stands on its own, no longer the 14-year-old boy holding the hand of its mother, his mother, my apologies. Today, and for most of the last 100 years, Australia has commemorated that fateful day on the 25th of April 1915. This day has become known as Anzac Day, a day which would be more similar to Britain's Remembrance Day and the United States of America's Veterans Day. Veterans and serving military members alike don their uniforms and medals and march through cities, towns, all over the country. A sombre parade where Australians clap and cheer as the servicemen march past. Afterwards is a truly Australian experience where everyone raises a glass of beer and remembers the men who have fallen in times of conflict. Remarkably, a battle that was 100 years ago, which has no living survivors, still takes centre stage. Gallipoli can be a politically sensitive subject as well. In the past few years, we have seen legitimate attempts to adjust our usage of Anzac Day. The loss of life in Afghanistan, and particularly the veterans who have come back, have pushed for more support in the struggles that they will continue to have because of their service. Naturally, as a serviceman, I hope that the government put acceptable funds into veterans' affairs. The veterans of Gallipoli are honoured for the losses they have had to endure. We should remember this moving forward and remember all soldiers, sailors and airmen who have had to struggle in the name of Australia for the past 100 years. I'd like to, another quote of Churchill's, which is, I really liked it. He said it in 1948, and I just thought I'd share it with you now. So, open quote. "The British Empire itself seemed knit together by ties which none but its citizens could understand. What combinations of events could ever bring back again to France and Flanders, the formidable Canadians of the Vimy Ridge, the glorious Australians of Villiers-Bretonneux, the dauntless New Zealanders of the crater fields of Passchendaele, the steadfast Indian Corps, which in the cruel winters of 1914 had held the line by Armentières." And I think that's me.